Hello, and welcome back to our series where we are building a people and culture management system brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions. And in this video, I would like us to create a dependent dropdown, a cascading dropdown. It's only going to be two levels. And essentially what that is our first or our second dropdown is dependent on the first dropdown. So the values within our second dropdown will depend on what was selected in our first one. And I want to do that dynamically. So what I've done was I've created a new tab over here called Web App Data. And this is going to house all of our data. And let's get rid of the bottom too so we can show the dynamic of this approach. And what I want to do is grab essentially this first column here and have that populate our first drop down. And then this subcategory is going to populate values dependent on that first selection. So first, to do that, we need to create our drop down boxes. So let's go over here to Bootstrap, since that's what we're using as our front end toolkit. And I would like a drop down in the form of an input group because I really do like how Bootstrap has this span element here to where we can put a title. So let's scroll down and see if they have something like that instead of just a regular. Yep, here we go. Okay, so we got buttons. Not a fan of that. Here we go. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. We put the title here, drop down here. So it's this little thing right here. So let's just copy that and then we'll go back over to our code and add that in. And I'm going to leave this stuff up here for now, but let's create our two drop downs. This will be the first drop down. This will be the second drop down. And we don't need this for, so let's start giving our drop down some information here. Just trying to think. This is the hardest thing that I always deal with is trying to think of what to call them. Let's just call this category. We'll keep it the same as our spreadsheet. That way we know this element goes to that tab or that column, I should say. And this is going to be category. So the label and the category IDs or the select IDs fine. Now we're not going to need this because these options here, because I'm going to populate those dynamically with forEach. And then this one will be subcategory. Category. And then this one here will be subcategory. And I'll leave the options in there for now. We'll just get it functional and I'll change that later. Again, we're not going to need this. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is we're going to populate this first drop-down box once our page finishes loading. And what we're going to do is need to do is actually create an event listener. So I know we have this piece here, but let's get it functional and then we'll move our JavaScript over to our JavaScript file. So let's create a quick script tag here. Again, if you're not quite sure what it is that I'm doing and why, you can go back to our channel and look at maybe learning Google Apps Script or beginning Google Apps Script, and it'll explain what it is that I'm doing here. So what I'll do is I'll create a comment here and we'll say populate first drop down when page loads page content. I'd rather have the content load because if it runs before this is loaded, then it's not going to do anything. We want it to be content loads. Okay, so to do that, we're going to need to create an event listener, document, add event listener. And that event listener is going to be when the DOM content loads. So DOM, remember DOM is all uppercase, and content is loaded. Yeah. And then what we're going to do is run a function. Now, when I create code, I build in pauses when I write to go back and kind of clean up code. And what ends up happening is I tend to change the same exact thing. And when I do that, I realize that when I'm writing new code, I just change it ahead of time. And this is one of those things. Instead of spelling out, the function you want, you can simply, in this case, leave an empty parentheses where you would pass the parameters and then do an arrow function. And then that arrow function indicates that it's going to run a function. And the function that we're going to want to run is we want to send something over to our Google Apps script side and then get something back. So we're going to need to do Google script run, and this is going to have a success handler. And the function that we're going to want to run over on our Google Apps script side, our server side, is, let's just call that function get first dropdown. Sorry for the well thought out name there, but it works, or it will work once we get done with it. And when it receives this, spell it right, when it sends this over and it comes back successful, we want to run another function over here. And let's call that function, let's do populate categories. And then the second one we'll do populate second categories or something along those lines, or subcategories, I guess it'd be. Okay, so now we have that. So now what we need to do is go into our Google Apps script side, our server side, and then create this get first dropdown and have it do what it is that we need to do. So let's jump over to our main.js over here. And let's create that category. We'll create it down here at the bottom. Function get first. What was it? Get first dropdown. Just copy that. Okay, get first dropdown. It's not going to take an argument because there's nothing that's really giving and sending it over there. But what we're going to want this to do is we're going to want this to come in here and grab all of these values, starting at row 2, column 1, all the way down to the last row and for one column. So for this, we can create a variable. Now I took variables and moved them up here to be global variables so all of our functions can use it. And we're going to want to come up here to our web app data, which is that page. So let's create a constant, and we'll call that constant drop one cat. That'll work. And then we're going to want to go into our web app data. We're wanting to get a range, and that range is going to be at the second row, first column. And then we're going to want to get the last row of that data. And since we're starting out at the second row, it's going to take that top row and add it to the bottom, or at least the number. So you're going to have a empty row, which we don't want. We can get rid of that by saying -1. And then we want that to be one column, and then we want to get the values of that. So now this is going to come to us in a two-dimensional array, and we can see that. Let's log this out, and you'll see how it's going to come to us. And now let's run this function here, get first dropdown. And you'll see that this is a two-dimensional array, and it contains duplicates. Now we could write a code that will then map this or create a one-dimensional array and then go through and remove all the duplicates and create another array of unique values. Or there's a different way that we can do this, and we can use what's called new set, which constructs a new array based on the criteria that we give. So let's create another constant here, and this constant will be the one that we send over to our HTML. And what we want this to do is create a new set array set, basically. And what we want to use is this drop one cat, and we want to flatten that. And that'll take that two-dimensional array down to a one-dimensional array. And then this new set, when it constructs that new array, it will remove the duplicates. So they will be unique values. So let me go ahead and write this. I'll write a comment up here. And what this does is, this is a built-in JavaScript object, which automatically removes duplicates, and using flat takes a 2D array to 1D. And this is incredibly helpful because it takes multiple lines of data and you can put it in one with new set. And it's very handy. So just keep that in mind if you are doing what we're doing now, so you're not having to write excess stuff. And let's log this out and I'll show you exactly what it does. So we'll log out the drop one cat first, and then we will log out our new array after our new set. So as you can see, we have a two-dimensional array here. And then after running that new set in flat, it flattens it down to a one-dimensional array and creates a new array by removing the duplicate values and so on. So that's good. Okay, so now what we want to do is we'll get rid of these. Don't need to log them, but what we do need to do is return the drop one. So this is returning to our HTML side. So this is getting sent over to our HTML side. And once that is successful, it's going to run this function. Well, we'll create this function, and this function is going to take as an argument that returned value. Now this return value is coming to it over as data. In order to use it, we have to give it a name. We could just, we'll just call it categories. That's how we'll refer to it, because that's really what it is. That way we know categories here and category up here corresponds to that first column in our page. And then what we're going to want to do here is manage that array, because it's coming to us. It's coming to us as that one-dimensional array. So if we were to just populate this, what would end up happening is it would populate that entire array. What we need to do is loop through that array for each element and create a value and a text property for it, and then place that in its own option. So to do this, I prefer to use the forEach loop. So what we'll do is we will create a constant, and we'll call this the category dropdown. And this category dropdown is going to be equal to this up here. So we need to grab that element by the ID. So this will be document get element by ID. And we're not doing anything with it yet. We just need to grab it and set our focus to it. And then what we're going to do is take the categories that is being passed to us. And for each one of those elements, we want to run a function. Now, we could spell out function here, of course, but I'm going to use arrow functions, sort of like we did up here. So we want to, within that category, we want to run a function, and that function is essentially going to create an option. So let's create a constant, and we'll just call it option. And this is going to be document No, we're not getting in a element by ID, or we're not getting anything. What we're doing is we're wanting to create this option element. So we create element, and the element that we are wanting to create is option. Because if you remember, we had option value 1 was 1, option value 2 was 2. And what we're wanting to do is essentially create these options for every single element that's coming over to us in that array. So now we can take this option variable and set a property to it. The first property we're going to need is the value, and that value is going to equal a category. And remember, this could be named anything. We just have to ensure that this argument is consistently applied throughout, and we're just calling it category because that's what it is. It's category. And then after the option, we need to set the text. And to do that, we type in text content. And that text content is also going to be the category. Now that we have the options declared, the option variable declared, and then we're given the option a couple properties, now we need to append it. And we append it to this variable. And this variable contains this element here. So we're wanting to append it to this parent. That's what this is called here, this parent. And since this is not the parent, this is a child, we need to append the child. So we need to grab our dropdown variable and we need to append a child, and the child is going to be this option with the added properties. So we just simply put option. So if we were to save this, let me add a semicolon there. If we were to save this and then come back up here to our web app and we refresh our web app, you'll see that we have our two select boxes, which look nice. I like it. We'll change this options thing and give it some styling here later. But when this is loaded, it should populate, and it does. It should populate the elements within that array. Now, it's not doing the entire array. It would just be here on this line. It's not populating it that way. Because we used forEach, it's taking each element and then doing something with it. It's running a function on each element. And what we're doing is we're creating an option tag here. And then in that option, or that option element, and in that option, we're giving it a value, which would be total rewards. And then we're also giving it the text total rewards. So now what we can do is use this to actually create our secondary dropdown. So in order to trigger that, we are going to need to run something when our first dropdown changes. So what we can do is we can force a function here. Instead of creating an event listener, we can simply force a function, and we'll call that function on, or we'll use on change. So anytime something changes here, it will run a function, and we will call that function update sub categories. That works. And we'll need our parentheses. So now we need to create this update subcategories function. So we'll come down here, and this function is going to require an if statement. So let me type this here and you'll see what I mean. So what we want to check is if there's a value or anything in that first drop-down box. Remember, we're creating a value property here, and that value is going to be whatever that element is through this category. So we want to check to see if that drop-down box has a value. If it does, then we can run something. If it doesn't, we want to do something else. So let's work on if that category has a value. And in order to do that, we got to get the value first of that category. So let's create a constant. We'll call this category. Now we're not calling it category dropdown because we have the focus of the category. So we'll just call it category. And category is going to equal that element by ID. So let's grab that, get element by ID, and that's going to be this category element. And we are going to want to get the value of that. So the value of that is now stored in this category. So we can run our if statement. And our if statement is going to check that category. But since we're looking for a value, we're just looking for any value. We don't care what it's equal to. We are just looking for some kind of value. We actually don't need to use an operator such as strictly equal to or whatever, because we're not checking for a specific value. We're just checking to see if something is there. And if something is there, anything is there, we can run a chunk of code. And if not, then we run something else. Now, the code that we want to run, if there is something there, is going to be a Google script run because we want to send essentially a set of instructions or a variable over to our Google app script side, our server side, have it grab that second column and then pull it back over. So this is also going to be with a success handler. And the function that we're going to want to run over on our Google Apps Script side is, let's just call it get second dropdown. Now this dropdown is going to pass a piece of information over to our Google Apps Script side. And the information that it's going to send is this category. Whatever value is in our first dropdown box. And when that comes back successful, we want it to run something else. And let's just call this, since we call this one up here, populate categories, we'll have this populate sub categories. So pretty self-explanatory. And then if there isn't a value in here, this is a perfect opportunity for us to clear that second drop-down box. Because when you're dealing with populating really anything into a field or a cell in a spreadsheet, you should always think about how it is that you're going to clear that when you don't need it. So we can just create ourselves a separate function. Anytime that I clear something, I prefer to have a function to where we can just simply call that function. And we'll just call this function clear drop down. And there we go. So let's clear this. Let's create this function here real quick. And this function is going to take a string, and I want that string to be the ID of this. And there's a reason for that. So let's actually come down here now and create that clear drop down function. And it's not going to be, it's not going to be anything special. It's just going to be a simple function to clear everything. And we can use this clear drop down in the future to clear all of our values. So let's do that. And now this is going to take this subcategory string. And what this subcategory string is really the drop-down ID. So we can name that information that's being passed simply drop-down. We'll just call it drop-down ID. Now we need to create a constant. And this constant we'll call drop-down. And this is going to be equal to that value that's being passed. So it's going to be this subcategory. This is the ID. We're passing the ID as a string, and we are using that string to dynamically change our get element by ID. So now anytime that we want to clear something, if we have another field called, employee name, we can simply call that function and then pass the ID employee name to it, and we won't have to change this because it will just dynamically update itself. So good. And then what we want to do is take this dropdown, which contains our ID here, this variable right here. And what we want to do with that is set an inner HTML, inner, and then all capitalized. Is it? Yeah, all capitalized. That looks right. And we want to set that equal to whatever our HTML is that we want. Since we're setting an inner HTML, what we're setting it to has to be a HTML. We want that to be in a string. And we're wanting to set the option value of that select box to nothing. And then let's give it some text. Let's just say select an option. And what this is going to do is sort of serve two purposes. It's going to clear it and then populate this select an option. And then the other purpose is going to serve is it's going to let us know when this runs. So we'll know when this is updated. And then we want to give ourselves a closing tag, the closing option tag, and then that. Okay, so that's good. So now we have our clear dropdown. What we need to create is this populate subcategories. So we'll put that up here, function populate subcategories. And we'll leave this function blank for now because we also have to create this get secondary or get this second drop down over on our Google Apps script side. So let's copy this and create this one over here on our server side first. So let's go back to our main. And we can just create it after our first drop down. Function. Now remember, it's bringing over this category. And if we wanted to, we can just leave it that way. Well, let's just leave it category. And let's create the same thing that we did up here the same way. This will be drop to cat. And this drop to cat is going to be equal to our web app data. And we are going to get the range 2-1, because that's where we're going to want to start. And then we're going to want to get the last row like we did before. Get last row. And since we're starting out at 2, we've got to get rid of that empty piece at the bottom. Now, we're not wanting one column because this is a dependent drop-down box. This second column depends on the first column. So we actually have to get all of this. So we need to include 2 columns, and then we want to get the values of all of that. So now what we're going to need to do is we need to filter and map. So let's create another constant. We'll call this drop to because this variable, the end result, is actually going to be what we return back over to our HTML. And the first thing that we'll do is do a filter. And if you haven't watched my previous videos on filtering and map, please do so because this will explain it a lot. And you can actually take a filter first and then map the results of that filter because a filter creates a new array, and then you can carry on that line of instructions by doing map on that array. So you're not having to create 2 separate lines. So this is going to be drop to cat. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to filter that. And then we'll use arrow notation, and let's just, no, we won't use arrow notations. Just in case the arrow notation is new to you, I'll write out the function, and then once we go back and clean it up, I'll change it. And this is going to be a row. That's what we'll be passing. And this row is going to return the row at every single 0 index. So this row, we are wanting initially to return and filter by this. So we're using our dropcat variable, which contains all our values, and then we're filtering that variable by row, and we're using this, we're writing it out longhand just in case you're unfamiliar with arrow functions, and we'll change this later once we clean it up. And this is going to be at the index 0, that first column. And since we're filtering this, it's on a condition. We want to return it if it is strictly equal to that category that's coming over. Now, that category is the value of that first box, that first drop-down box. Okay, so now we have that done. We'll add a semicolon here. So we're filtering it based on what's coming over to us from our HTML, that value. And if that value equals the row at that index 0, it's going to return it. Now, instead of ending this here, we can carry this on and then map that result. And the mapping result we want is to use that row and then return that next column over, that second column, that value in that second column, which is our row at the index 1. Remember, index based starts at 0. So this would be that first column. Then it grabs it if that category. So if, for an example, say this was, the value of that first cell was talent intelligence. So talent intelligence, the value would be passed here. And then if talent intelligence was in that first column or the 0 index, it would then return it into a new array. So what would happen is it would come through here line by line. It would grab this one, it would grab this one, and then it would put these two in a new array. And then what we would do is map that based on this second column. We would just pull out talent acquisitions and career pathing. And then if it was total rewards, it would grab this one, and then it would just grab those two values and put it into a one-dimensional array. So let's make sure that we get our semicolons here in place. Okay, so now these are callback functions. So we know that we can only return one value per function, and these return values are part of this callback function, which belongs to the map and filter method. So we haven't actually returned anything from this second drop-down function yet. We've just returned a value for map and filter and then stored that result in this drop-down 2, or this drop 2. So what we need to do is return that drop 2. And when we return that drop 2, it's going to send that back over to our HTML side. So let's go back over to our HTML side. And where it's going to send it is it's going to send it to this populate subcategories. And this subcategories is going to receive that return drop 1 value. And let's pass that or call that argument, since we called we call the categories up here. So let's just call this subcategories. And then we can take the same exact thought that we did up here and do it to build out our second drop down. So first we're going to need that constant, and that constant is going to be subcategory drop down, and that is going to be equal to document get element ID, and that ID is not going to be categories, it's going to be our subcategory. Make sure that's exactly what it is. Subcategory, yep, right there. And we don't want to do anything with that. We just want it to be focused on it right now. And what we would like to do is, in case there is something in that second box already, we would like to clear it. So let's call that clear drop-down function again. And we're going to pass subcategory through that just to clear it so there's nothing there hanging out. Because again, some users will beat your code running, but if that code is already doing something, it can slow them down. And I know you don't ever really want to slow your user down, but in this case, we want to make sure there's something populated there prior to them actually using it. Okay, so now what we can do is take our subcategories, and for each one of those elements, we will do for each, and we will do our arrow function here. And remember, we are, wow, that is horrible English. Subcategory. There we go. That's better. Remember, this is just something that we're referencing, so this can be anything. You can use like R or something. I'm just going to use subcategory since we did category up here. And we'll do our arrow function, and that function is going to instruct it to, one, create that option constant. And that option constant is going to be the document. And remember, we're not getting it. We are creating an element. And that element that we are creating is our option. And now we can take this option variable, which is the option element, and add properties to it. And those properties are our value. And the value is going to be equal to the subcategories coming over to us. Oh, no, correction. The subcategory that we're using. So we need to reference each element, which is what's stored there. And then we also need to give it a property of the text. So remember, we use text content, and that is also going to be equal to that subcategory up here. And what we then need to do is we need to append the child, just like we did up here, except it's not going to be the category dropdown, it's going to be this. For that, we're going to append the child, and the child is going to be our option. So now let's make sure that we have our semicolons, semicolon, 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 and semicolon. Okay, good. So now when we save this, unless I misspelled something horribly, it should work. So let's come back over here to our web app, and let's refresh this. Once the DOM content is loaded, okay, it's not working. So let's figure out why. So now it's not pulling this. Okay, so that means that something's happening with the DOM. Let's come back over here to our code and see what it is that could be trying this. Now, the way I approach things like this that happen that shouldn't happen or that we're not wanting to happen is I start removing chunks of things that we did. So let's comment out our clear drop down piece here. And so, yep, we have all that. So now let's save this and then go back and see if we've isolated at least what's keeping it. Now, typically when something doesn't work right off the bat, there's usually like a syntax error or something. So let's come back here. We'll share this. Let's wait for it to share. Okay, there it is. We'll refresh this, and now let's see if it works. Okay, so now it works. Career pathing, union relations. You'll notice that that's not actually changing anything because that clear drop down was trying to change that. And you notice that it's not actually clearing it, it's just adding to it. So we have career pathing. So we want this to be cleared to start over. So it'll, instead of building on top of it and appending the child on top of what's already there, we want to clear it. So let's come back over and look at our clear drop down code. And what we can do to isolate it down is let's leave the clear drop down references, comment it out, and just open up this clear drop down. We'll come over here, we'll refresh it, see if we get functionality. Okay, nope, we're not getting functionality. So that means that there is something here within our clear drop down function. Okay, so let me look at this real quick. I'm going to go line by line and see if I can spot the error. To me, it appears that it may just be a syntax error somewhere, like I forgot a decimal or something, period. So give me just a sec. Okay, so coming back over to this page, I see exactly what we did now. So if you look at our options piece right here, we have this in the form of a string. Now we can use double quotations or single quotations, but if we have an inner quotation, they have to be different. So unfortunately, this is the typo right here. It's saying that this is a string and this is another string. So a simple fix to this, at least I hope, is going to be making the outer one single and then the inner one that we're setting the value to nothing as double. So let's save this and then come back over. Okay, now we should be able to at least get the functionality of our Dropbox, which means that we're not getting a syntax error. There's union stewards. Now, we haven't called that function yet, so it should just keep building on to this union stewards, and it is, yep. So as you can see, every time we select something, it's just appending to the very end. So we're getting the functionality. So now let's come back over here and uncomment out our function calls. And now this should work perfectly now that we've taken care of that syntax error. So let's refresh this. And we'll select our first drop down, talent intelligence, and it is good. So now we're changing the value and text of that to select an option so we can select that. Now when we go back and select one, it should change this, it clear it and change it to select an option, but then it shouldn't carry on to it. It should start fresh. So we'll do employee relations. Yep, there it is, and it's fresh. Okay, good. So now we have a fully functional dependent dropdown. I'm going to end the video here, and offline before the next video, I'm going to get rid of this thing and do some styling here. Y'all don't need to sit here and watch me do CSS, but I'll do some styling here, and then in the next video, we will build out a response to when somebody hits cultural engagement or whatever it is, because we want this selection on the second drop-down box to actually do something, whether it's render another page, ask another question, or whatnot. So I hope you're enjoying this series. If you are, please hit that subscribe button and we can continue bringing you series of this nature. And until next time, please take care.